In this episode, we dive into the topic of political power and technological truth. We cover the real driving force of history, political power that triumphs over technological truth, the secret to society's morality by exploring its fascinating history, a past that people in power truly care about, how they distill documents into useful parables and find examples that support their narrative while ignoring those that don't, two models of history writing, the political determinist model versus the political mascot model, how not to be fooled by those who claim to write the first draft of history because they're usually just the winners, why you should beware of political mascots, a tactic used by winners pretending to act on behalf of losers, what events are really shaping our world, and the hidden stories behind off-narrative events, how history is distorted, and we can uncover regime media to discover how they manipulate events from 1619 to today's headlines, why you don't want to settle for the history the establishment wants you to hear, how comparing political history is what allows us to make fair judgments of those in power, and we dove into all the juicy examples and summarized them for you so you could learn the history quickly and see how it applies. Since we're just starting out and could really use your support, if you like this episode, please tantalize that like button into a sweet, sweet slumber. Share this episode, comment, sign up for our newsletter, and retweet our episodes to @Balajis, that's BALAJIS, so we can get his attention and get him on the podcast. I promise we'll make it all worth it for you. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Network State Podcast, potentially Network State Insights, still TBD. Today we have a very exciting episode on political power and technological truth. We have moved on from chapter 2.2 and we are now in chapter 2.3. So much to dive into in this one and so many external links. We're going to do our best to summarize all of this for you. So in the top-down view, history is written by the winners. It is about political power triumphing over technological truth. Why does power care about the past? Because the morality of society is derived from its history. When the Chinese talk about Western imperialism, they aren't just talking about some forgettable dust-up in the South China Sea, but how that relates to generations of colonialism and oppression, to the Eight Nations Alliance and the Opium Wars, and so on. And when you see someone denounced on American Twitter as an Xist, history is likewise being brought to bear. So what he means by Xist is like, are you a racist or xenophobist or anything like that, right? Again, why are Fascist. They bad? Because our history of Xism. As such, when you listen to a regime's history, which you are doing every time you hear its official organs praise or denounce someone, you should listen critically. Okay.
Like the,
so the first...
stomach
go ahead.
organ.
Yeah. Yeah, we love stomach organs. So
of the government.
This part is divided into two pieces. The first is political power as the driving force of history, and that's what we're going to dive into now. So how do the authorities use history? What techniques are they using? It's not just a random collection of names and dates. They have proven techniques for sifting through the archives, for staffing a retinue of heroes and villains from the past, for distilling the documents into politically useful parables. Here are two of them. So this is the political determinist model. History is written by the winners. People have heard this saying, but taking it seriously has profound implications. For example, whoever claims to be writing the first draft of history is therefore one of the winners. For another, history is what's useful to the regime. A classic example is the Katyn Forest. The admission that the Soviets did it would have delegitimized, and actually before going into that, so the Katyn Forest was a atrocity committed by the Soviet Union on April 13th, 1990. They admitted to carrying out the massacre of 22,000 Polish officers, prisoners of war, and intellectuals in the Katyn Forest near Smolensk, Russia, during World War II. And the Soviets had previously blamed the atrocity on the Germans, but evidence, including eyewitness accounts and forensic investigations, pointed to Soviet guilt. So the admission was a significant moment in Soviet-Polish relations and allowed for a greater transparency and cooperation between the two nations. And so that admission that the Soviets, or the admission that the Soviets did it, would have delegitimized their post-war control over Poland during the 1945 to 1991 period. But once the USSR collapsed, the truth could be revealed. Now, the other model is the political mascot model, where history is written by winners pretending to be acting on behalf of losers. And this is a variant of the political determinist model, also known as offense archaeology. So offense archaeology discusses how some scholars are digging into the past in search of offenses committed by historical figures. And these scholars often engage in what Pinero, who wrote the article, calls offense archaeology, which involves scrutinizing the past to uncover instances of racism, sexism, homophobia, or other forms of bigotry. Pinero argues that this approach to history is flawed, as it ignores the context in which these historical figures lived and fails to consider the complexity of human nature. Moreover, Pinero notes that offense archaeology is often driven by political agendas, which can distort the historical record and limit our understanding of the past. Instead, Pinero argues that scholars should approach history with an open mind and seek to understand the past in its own terms without imposing our contemporary values and judgments on it. Kind of see this as wokeism applied to history. And it's practiced by the modern American, Chinese, and Russian establishments, all of whom portray themselves as victims. The technique is to pick a mascot that the state claims to champion, such as the Soviet Union's proletariat, and then go through history to find the worst example of the state's current rival doing something bad to them. So take these real events, put them on the front page, and ensure everyone knows of them. Conversely, ensure off-narrative events are ignored or suppressed as taboo. Again, taking the USSR as a case study, this involved finding endless real examples of Western capitalists screwing the working class and suppressing the worst, also real instances of Soviet communists gulagging their working class, as well as cases of the working class itself behaving badly. Generalization to other contexts is left as an exercise for the reader. But here's a Russian example of what an American would call responsibility to protect. So the Russian example links out to an article, to a tweet by Lionel Page here, which I actually think is really well summarized in this graphic. So it's Putin holding a giant club and a puppet of a Russian in Ukraine screaming for help, and then Putin saying, "I'll rescue you," and that's how he invades Ukraine as the excuse. So Lionel Page here, who made this tweet thread, basically breaks down throughout all of this how these different organizations like NATO and the CIS, which is the basically the Russian equivalent that kind of imposed the adherence of some of its allies into this organization, and used that as an excuse to then bully them into doing whatever it wanted. So, NATO is very often portrayed as this aggressive organization, but actually there are multiple examples of countries wanting to join NATO and NATO being like, no, we don't want you to join because we don't want to cause more issues or more conflict with you and the other countries like Russia that are trying to take you in as their allies. So yeah, any thoughts on this, Raph, before jumping into the responsibility to protect? Because that's also really interesting. Well, I guess we should dive into that and then get some thoughts. So, in responsibility to protect, it explores the concept of humanitarian intervention, which is when one country intervenes militarily in another country to stop human rights abuses. Right? So the author argues that this concept has been controversial in the past and some argue that it violates the principles of state sovereignty and non-intervention in the internal affairs of other countries. However, the author argues that there is a moral obligation to intervene when innocent lives are at stake, and that the failure to intervene can lead to even greater human suffering. And the author discusses several examples of successful humanitarian interventions, such as NATO's intervention in Kosovo in 1999, and argues that these interventions were necessary to stop human rights abuses. The article concludes by stating that the moral logic of humanitarian intervention should be considered alongside the practical and political considerations involved in any military intervention. So yeah, let's just take a quick debrief here of everything that we've covered, right? Using political power as the driving force of history through either a political determinist model or a political mascot model, and then the concept of do countries have a responsibility to protect?
Which one do you want to tackle first?
I think we can go with the political determinist model first, which is where history is written by the winners. This is something that we have covered in the past. What I think is interesting is the example of the cat and forest, where much later down the line, when the USSR actually took the blame and ownership of that, it improved relations with Poland, right? Whereas the denial of it led to this 40-year period of unrest and mistrust. So I think that kind of speaks to, it's kind of funny, but like treating countries as kids, like, hey, if you talk out your problems, you're going to have a better chance of solving them rather than denying them.
Yeah, and it's a backing for his thesis that if things were more transparent, then things would actually be better. And it seems like even traditional government would benefit from that, actually, which I think is a strong underlying argument for the establishment of network states as legitimate. If it pushes, if you know, if they're truly better, then they should be pushing everybody up. It should be a healthy sort of competition.
I agree. Yeah, so it's definitely, you know, also a way to set the example moving forward. All right, and then the political mascot model, where history is written by winners pretending to be acting on behalf of losers, and the concept of offense archaeology, right? So, you know, basically wokeism applied to history, and the examples of, you know, Putin saying, well, we want to protect the Russians that are in Ukraine and they're asking for help, so that gives us a reason, a good reason to invade.
A casus belli, my colleague.
Can you speak up a bit, Raph? I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
I'll speak quiet.
Just whisper.
I'll make sure even my neighbors can hear me.
Yeah.
Because it's a quite interesting podcast, I would say. I think if your neighbors aren't listening to this right now, then they're missing out on some key discussions about how the government is manipulating the information that we hear so that it portrays itself in a better light. I mean, like, you would do it. Come on, Adrian, you do it.
I mean, it's
what do we
definitely
post on social media?
Everything it's like classic misdirection.
So are we saying the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans are like magicians? Yeah, they're pretty good magicians.
Pretty much, yeah.
Is the magician actually killing people in the end? Maybe, but how do you think it does the chopping thing? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like, you know, it's interesting to think about where does the role of other countries, especially powerful countries, lie in rectifying these, I mean, potentially international conflicts, but conflicts within other countries that could lead to their own demise, right? I mean, at that point, it is kind of game theory, but there is a moral and ethical consideration that needs to be had here, right? If Russia invades Ukraine, is it the responsibility of NATO to do something about that? And if so, why? And to what extent? And why, you know, like, why did they do it in Kosovo, right? You know, if the
Sure,
variables are that, you know, innocent lives are at stake, and that if there is no intervention, then there will be even greater suffering, then it's, I mean, pretty logical that this would apply in the Russia-Ukraine invasion. So what's there to talk about, right? Like, why do we have these other filters? And I guess it's because the military intervention is a much messier proposition than fighting a proxy war and imposing sanctions, right? You can still theoretically get a significant amount of leverage to influence the oppressor's actions, or kind of like discourage them strongly, we'll say, to do these things or to make these crimes against humanity.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I was going to suggest we send some troops to the moon as sort of like a fake out, and then we can invade from the skies, which would be kind of cool. I think that was a plot to a Swedish or Finnish movie, I think it was, about
Those
Nazis.
Finnish, they're
So
creative, yeah.
yeah, I think they made a couple of them actually. But I mean, I want to talk about the responsibility to protect at the end. Also, the use of gulagging as a verb. I don't know. Is that a thing? Can you just say that? I don't know. Is that insensitive? I don't know.
Probably, yeah. Okay, cool. So
Okay.
we'll come back to that then, and we'll keep moving. Okay, so the next part here is, these techniques are used to write history that favors a state. Here are more examples.
I
CCP
like these
China.
examples.
So today's Chinese media covers the 8 Nations Alliance, the Opium Wars, and the like exhaustively in its domestic output, as these events show the malevolence of the European colonialists, who literally fought wars to keep China subjugated and addicted to heroin. Their domestic history does not mention the Uyghurs, Tiananmen, and the like domestically. Xi's CCP, and that's like Xi Jinping's Chinese Communist Party, did stress the domestic problem of corruption via the Tigers and Flies campaign. I thought this was really interesting.
Yeah,
So the Tigers and Flies campaign is basically how Xi Jinping tried to fight, quote unquote, fight Chinese corruption. So the article discusses the case of former Chinese politician Bo Xilai, who was sentenced to life in prison in 2013 for corruption and abuse of power. The case is presented as an example of how corruption is a systemic problem in China that goes all the way up to the top. And the article also discusses the case of Shanxi coal baron Liu Han, who was sentenced to death in 2014 for corruption, organizing and leading a mafia-style organization, and murder. The case is presented as an example of how corruption and organized crime are intertwined in China. And the article discusses the use of red envelopes, or hongbao, in China as a form of bribery. The author describes how red envelopes are used to bribe officials and employees, and how they have become so normalized that they are often seen as a legitimate way to do business in China. And then the article discusses the use of naked officials, or tunguan, in China, which refers to officials who have sent their family members and assets overseas. The author argues that naked officials are a symptom of the deep-rooted corruption problem in China, as they are able to use their connections and resources to benefit themselves and their families at the expense of the public. Not very communist. Overall, the article uses these and other examples to illustrate how corruption is a systemic problem in China that affects all levels of society, and how the Chinese government's efforts to combat corruption have been only partially successful. Now, the other really interesting piece about this Tigers and Flies campaign is that it was incredibly politically useful to Xi Jinping. And by that, I mean it helped him consolidate his power and win the support of the Chinese people. Because by cracking down on both high-ranking officials and low-level bureaucrats, Xi was able to signal his commitment to fighting corruption at all levels of the government. This made him popular with the Chinese public, who had become increasingly disillusioned with corruption and its negative effects on society. Additionally, the campaign helped Xi to remove potential rivals and consolidate his power within the Communist Party by targeting corrupt officials at all levels of the party. He was able to root out potential challengers to his leadership and cement his position as China's most powerful leader in decades, right? So it's, again, kind of using this political mascot model where, virtue signaling to the public and saying, hey, corruption's bad and I'm going to fight it. But at the same time, I'm also going to use this as an excuse to take out all my potential enemies or competitors so that no one can challenge my rule.
Classic bait and switch.
Yeah, pretty chill. And then moving on or do you want to comment on that, Raph, before moving on to the U.S. establishment? This one's biggie.
Yeah, I'm aware. I would just say that the common thread that we're seeing with these examples and the previous examples is sort of what we hinted at in the beginning, which is that, if there was more legitimate, concrete, transparent information going around, these kinds of campaigns with ulterior motives would be less likely to occur. Interests would be in the open, and that's all based on Balaji's model of cryptographically verifiable history, right? So
yeah.
I just don't want us to lose that sort of North Star in this chapter as we're getting more and more, because unfortunately he opens all of these examples. He doesn't really close them until we get to the end, and I don't want us to get so far off track that people are like, oh, okay, that was a great history lesson, but what's that got to do with with network states?
Totally. Great point. Okay, so the U.S. establishment is another example. So today's U.S. establishment covers 1989, so June 4th, 1989, and the 2022 Russo-Ukrainian War heavily, because they are real events that make China and Russia look bad and the U.S. look good. It does not mention the 1900 Eight Nations Alliance, which is also linking out to an article which, in summary, is about how when Americans ruled Beijing, in the early 20th century, American diplomats and military personnel played a significant role in shaping the modernization of Beijing. It begins by discussing the American Legation Quarter, which was established in Beijing in 1900 and became a hub of Western influence. It then goes on to talk about how some of the Americans who played key roles in shaping Beijing, such as John Calvin Ferguson, who helped modernize the Beijing police force, and Edwin Reischauer, who later became the U.S. ambassador to Japan. The article discusses the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, which saw foreign powers, including the U.S., invade Beijing to put down a rebellion against foreign influence. And this event cemented American dominance in the region and allowed for the establishment of the American Legation Quarter. Finally, the article talks about the role of American missionaries in China and how they help spread Western education and ideas. So overall, it highlights the significant role that Americans played in shaping a modern Beijing in the early 20th century. And so Balaji goes on to say, when the U.S. helped invade China with a coalition of the willing to defend European imperialism, or the 1932 Ukrainian Holodomor, which also links out to an article that basically is summarized as when the New York Times company's Walter Duranty helped Soviet Russia choke out Ukraine, as these cut in the opposite direction. So the current U.S. narrative also does not stress the Cultural Revolution, which also links out to another article summarized as So Chinese Cultural Revolution Lessons for America's Cancel Culture by Doug Bando. the author argues that the cancel culture movement in the United States shares many similarities with the Chinese Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s. During that time, Chinese leaders targeted and persecuted individuals who were deemed counter-revolutionary, which led to violence, chaos, and widespread suffering. Bandow suggests that the current cancel culture movement in the United States similarly seeks to silence and punish those who do not conform to a specific set of beliefs or opinions. He argues that this mentality threatens freedom of expression, democracy, and the fundamental principles of American society. The author also suggests that this mentality, what's up?
I just hadn't said anything for a while, so I said USA.
Yeah. The author also suggests that this mentality has infiltrated many institutions in the United States, including academia, media, and government. And in conclusion, Bandow urges Americans to be wary of cancel culture and its potential consequences, and to remember the lessons of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. He encourages people to embrace diverse opinions, engage in open dialogue, and resist the urge to silence those who disagree with them, right? So the common thread you can see, and moving on, he says, or Western journalists like Edgar Snow, who helped Mao come to power, or the full ugly history of American support for Russian and Chinese communism, which basically breaks down how we, or I should say Wall Street or certain American capitalists, actually, there's a case to be made, funded the Bolshevik Revolution. And then there's another case to be made for how what could have happened in China if the Kuomintang Nationalist Party had won against the Chinese Communist Party in their civil war. And so, in a nutshell, the potential economic, social, and political developments that could have occurred in China, as well as how it would have affected the world, argues that a victory by the Kuomintang would have resulted in a more capitalist and democratic China, but also a more unstable and authoritarian one, which is an interesting conflict there. The author suggests that the United States may have become more involved in China, leading to a different outcome in the Korean War and potentially altering the course of the Cold War, right? So even something as binary as who came to power during the Chinese Civil War would have had all of these massive macroeconomic and political implications today. And he goes on to say that this isn't simply a matter of the age of events. After all, regime media goes back further in time when convenient, distorting events from 1619 for today's headlines. And those also link out to ways in which the US has distorted its past, especially as it relates to slavery. So it's called the 1619 Project, which aims to reframe American history by placing slavery and Black Americans' experiences at the center of the story. The article argues that the project contains several factual errors and oversimplifications, and that it is based on an ideological commitment to the idea that the US was founded primarily as a slaveholding nation. The author argues that while the project brings attention to important issues, its historical inaccuracies risk undermining its credibility and fueling a reactionary backlash. And the article also critiques the project's framing of history as a political weapon rather than as a means of deepening understanding and fostering reconciliation. So this is an extremely hot topic, hot button topic. I'm sure there's going to be lots of very passionate opinions on both sides there. But I think it's kind of unfair to discount everything that happened during American slavery. And even if there hasn't been steps in reparations, the fact that just like in the Russia-Polish example with the Katyn Forest, if we don't acknowledge that past and explain and take ownership for how the US mistreated this group of people and how that's led to all of these systemic issues that are causing these inequalities and this polarization, we're not going to be able to get past it. So you know, I see both sides here. I think it's definitely an oversimplification and a kind of dismissive approach to say, okay, well, there's this project and it's poorly organized and there's some, you know, historical inaccuracies, and so, you know, we kind of throw it all out and it's going to have this backlash. Well, yeah, no shit, right? I mean, there was a lot of problems, a lot of pain caused. So obviously there's going to be backlash. The point is that we can take the backlash, talk about it, and come up with a solution that works, not just dismiss it.
Mm. Yeah. It's complicated because I mean, this is a personal cue of mine, but some of the sources, I mean, I guess it's not unexpected to hear because Balaji is coming from high tech sort of, I mean, obviously crypto space, which has like strong libertarian undercurrents within it. And when you look closer to some of these sources, I wouldn't call them necessarily neutral.
No, definitely not.
And his
they're
way of
highly
writing
opinionated pieces, like almost all of them.
Yeah, and then some of the sources themselves are not academically, you know, like substantiated or whatnot. So again, what I would just say to the listeners is these are different examples being brought. I think it adds a lot of color, which is cool, and it's cool to learn this. And I guess in that sense, we get an insight into his world. I'm curious to see if there's been any analysis on like the reading list that he has compiled, I guess, throughout this, because I was thinking about it in the earlier editions, but now it's like very clear for me that some of this stuff is like super libertarian. And if you want to make the argument that the networks, so I guess my question is, at what point can we even look at, should we be looking at the development of network states themselves as a libertarian movement or as something else? And we just have to be wary of that, is when he brings in these sources, that it may add, you know, push the concept further along a certain political spectrum. I don't have the weight to, you know, judge that really. It might be more obvious to other listeners, to other people. And I'd love to hear somebody's opinion on that before we hop into the next parts of the sections.
Yeah, I think
if it's out there.
Sure.
I don't know how you feel. Yeah.
I think like, so, you know, I'm just trying to think of it on a macro scale as well. Like, you know, it is definitely, the book is definitely coming at this from a libertarian perspective. And I don't want to like put it in a box. I want to say that it's, by libertarian, I mean like also just trying to present the facts on all sides. And that is, I think, the point. We want all sides to log their respective data on this shared history blockchain, so that every side gets logged, and then we can work towards repairing each of these issues one by one, right? But unless we have each opinionated piece, even if it's opinionated, I mean, like, that's what brings the motivation for that individual journalist or historian or whatever to look into those atrocities or look into those inequalities and make their case, right? And as long as their case is grounded in fact, and that fact is logged to the blockchain, now we can talk about that, right? It's something that everybody can see as fact, and therefore we have a much more even playing field when it comes to discussing these things. I think the part where we get lost is if we did the same thing that Russia did to Poland in that 40-year period of denying the forest massacre, because if we can't talk about it, and if we're not on the same page about what actually happened, forget about resolving those issues.
Forget about it. I was hoping you were gonna, I was wondering where you were gonna get our catchphrase in this episode, actually.
Yeah, forget about it.
Forget about it.
Network state insights. Cool. All right. So moving on to your section that you're going to dive into here, Raf. I'll read this portion, and then I want to hear what you think about ally Russia. So Balaji goes on to say, right, for the British Empire, the British in both World War I and World War II understandably emphasized the evils of Germany, but not so much the evils of their ally Russia. What are they talking about here?
I mean, specifically, you actually mentioned it before. The Soviets carried out atrocities against the Polish, atrocities against their own people, as we saw. And it's convenient for the British at the time to not point to those, but actually ignore them completely. Probably in the national media, probably didn't even, scale chart on any newspapers, so that it could carry out this idea that, well, we have an objective, we have this strong ally, and therefore, we can keep moving forward. Whereas if we took the time to and considered all of the bad things that both Russia, and we'll find out very soon what the British Empire itself did, then I think the argument would be, well, they wouldn't have gotten things done. I think there's what we're going to see next is that there's a counterpoint, which is, well, this is problematic, I guess, if you're the one in power. But if you become a second-rate actor or power or whatever it is, then suddenly you're no longer the center of attention, and therefore your previous mistakes get conveniently overlooked or they're pointed at, but because you're no longer in a position of power, it's kind of like, well, I guess just, what can we do? Can we make you do?
It's kind of like, I kind of extrapolated out to these power dynamics because, right, basically what this is saying, and just to, conclude, right, the British Empire was much more willing to hide the evils of their ally Russia because they're their ally, right? And continuing on, or their own evils during the Opium Wars, or the desire for the Indian subcontinent to breathe free, and so on. This one is almost too easy, as the UK is no longer a contender for heavyweight champion of the world, so no one is offended when someone points out its past self-serving inconsistencies. Indeed, documenting the UK's sins is now a cottage industry for Britain's virtue signalers, as beating up on a beaten empire is far easier than tackling the taboos of a still live one. Point being, once you get your head out of the civilization you grew up in and look at things comparatively, the techniques of political history become obvious. One of those techniques deserves special mention, and that's a peacetime version of the atrocity story. Should I read this quote or dive into atrocity story first?
No, go for it, because that is atrocity stories.
So one of the most time-honored techniques to mobilize public animosity against the enemy and to justify military action is the atrocity story. This technique, says Professor Laswell, has been used with unwavering success or unvarying success in every conflict known to man. The concept is as useful in peacetime as it is in war. Why? Because states get their people hyped up to fight wars by stressing the essentially defensive nature of what they are doing and the savage behavior of the enemy. But war is politics by other means, so politics is war by other means. Even in peacetime, the state is predicted on force, and this use of force requires justification. The atrocity story is the tool used to convince people that the use of state force is legitimate.
Yeah, so again, the atrocity story is to say, wow, look how bad this thing was. We most certainly must intervene. And usually that is to convince people to go to war, hype them up, because look how the Germans invaded Belgium and the Belgians were completely defenseless. Therefore, we really have to go and attack them. That's a very common, the common example for World War II, I think, for the UK. And definitely for the US, they would call them the Huns, right? The Germans would be called the Huns, and they had just attacked the defenseless Belgians, which I'm going to call the Brussels sprouts.
Yeah. So basically there are some legitimate reasons to go to war, but where that line is drawn and how that fits into this humanitarian need to do something about it, still a pretty significant gray area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's answering the question, why should we care? And sometimes people need to be nudged in the right direction, probably because you've been stuffing so much non-important information that they become numb to everything, or they become numb to real issues. And when a real issue pops up, then it's like, oh, okay, then we really have to whip it up, So I guess that would be an example of it being used well. His issue and the issue we get into by the end of it is, how do you know when it's true or not, basically.
Right. Okay, so coming from a different vantage point, René Girard would call this a founding murder. Once you see this technique, you see it everywhere. So what's a founding murder?
So founding murder, again, René Girard, a French philosopher, not quite as popular as Foucault, probably because he was a theological philosopher, so one who believed in the Bible. And that, for some people, that I guess is feels like a I mean, incorrectly would probably label that as some kind of oxymoron. But essentially, this French philosopher, great pronunciation, by the way, Adrian, you must have a little bit of French in you, pointed out that I guess his argument, and he uses often the Bible as an example, again, Christian, not the other versions or editions out there, depending on which one you have in your nightstand. But that culture or civilizations can often be traced back to a founding murder. I guess in the Christian sense, or in the biblical sense, you're probably going to see well, I mean, you're going to see Jesus in the biggest one. Even before that, I guess you would call it Cain and Abel. There is this idea that you can basically scapegoat an individual, an identity, a group, in a way of building as a way of building your own community, right? So again, atrocity story, similar here. Another crisis or tragedy has occurred, and this therefore is being instrumentalized for us to galvanize a group. I think actually today in critical theory or constructivism, if I remember my IR degree better, we would call this othering today. I think would be probably the mechanism in which this works is our identity is defined by defining what's outside of our identity. Right. The founding murder is one way of pointing a finger at something and saying that was bad, therefore we are good.
Got it. Yeah, it's making these divides, and it's kind of, I mean, I'm interested in seeing how this could also be useful, or when it's necessary, right? But so he goes on to say that what?
Because you're a sociopath.
Absolutely, yeah. So he says, once you see this technique, you see it everywhere. Somewhat toned down versions of the atrocity story are the go-to technique used to justify expansions of political power. If we don't force people to take off their shoes at the airport, people will die. If we don't stop people from voluntarily taking experimental curative drugs, people will die. If we don't set up a disinformation office to stop people from making hostile comments online, people will die. Indeed, almost everything in politics is backed by an atrocity story.
Just on that, you can really tell his background in investing in medical biotech, as well as his partnership with information technology. For sure. And then also, it really speaks to the libertarian side at this point. I mean, this is almost too clear. So, I don't know. Questions.
So he says there's a sometimes real, sometimes fake, sometimes exaggerated Girardian founding murder, or at least founding injury, behind much of what the government does. Sometimes the atrocity story is framed in terms of terrorist. What does he mean by that?
Framed actually just you click on it. It's a cute little cartoon, but basically it's a cartoon that shows how political action and narrative is massaged by corporations as dictated by government interests. So
Interesting. Okay, so here,
highly secure.
while it loads, just gotta make
You gotta-
them understand I'm not, in fact, a robot, just a sociopath.
Do you know what a palm tree is?
I don't know. What is that?
It's very long grass.
I actually love when he links out to little graphics and cartoons. I think it's just summarizes everything so much better.
There you go.
Yeah, that's a good one. Cool. Okay, so sometimes in terms of children, but the general concept is something so bad happened, we must use state force to prevent it from happening again. Often this completely ignores the death caused by that force itself. For example, when the FDA prevented deaths by cracking down on drug approvals after the lidomide, it caused many more deaths via Irum's law and drug lag. What are those?
Again, so we're seeing his biotech background in this case. But essentially, it's funny because he was actually touted, whatever, during Trump's presidency as potentially taking over the head of the FDA. So that's important to know when you're reading this.
Yeah.
But it doesn't. I wish there were a clear introduction of the author going through. I think these things need to be scrutinized, thought leaders, if you will. But so the two cases he brings in and the two criticisms which he has had of the FDA, although apparently he's since deleted most of those tweets, is that science is not actually being driven by scientific progress. The FDA is not there looking for the best technology or the best scientific advances, but is actually being pushed by, I guess it's outside, sometimes political forces, sometimes social forces, sometimes just like popular opinion, that kind of thing. So it can be overreactive and therefore skew the progress. And that, he says, will then be the reason. It's funny because I think this has been kind of a chip on his shoulder or one of his like pet issues, but he basically brings in this case as being like, well, look, these administrations are not actually being run for the purpose. I think forgetting perhaps that for the purpose of like improving the thing that they're administering, forgetting that administration itself is a purpose, but who knows? If you know what I mean. Like the government has its own interest. Just because it's regulating economy doesn't mean it should be economical. It's actually more probably governmental than it is economical. How do you take the government out of a governing administration? Maybe his argument is a network state does that. I'm not convinced. We'll see. Again, I think it depends a lot on culture and the vision that you set for it. Drug lag is self-explanatory. It's just the slow approval of new drugs.
Got it. So, and sometimes the atrocity story is just completely fake. Before Iraq was falsely accused of holding WMD, or weapons of mass destruction, it was falsely accused of tossing babies from incubators. What is he talking about here?
I looked into it and I didn't want to. I'm sorry, I'm not touching that.
Okay.
It's from I don't know. It's from a journal that I couldn't figure out, that I couldn't hear as being a good journal. Maybe it is. I don't know. Tried to read it. The information I was getting was weird. The only thing I'll just say is sometimes apparently collective knowledge or knowledge being built out of institutions can be itself be biased and twisted, especially when those sources aren't being checked. I think we know the story with the weapons of mass destruction, so that's probably the point just there.
Okay. With that said, it's possible to overcorrect here. Just because there is an incentive to fake or exaggerate atrocities does not mean that all atrocities are fake or exaggerated. Yes, you should be aware that states are always flopping. What does he mean by flopping?
Performing poorly on purpose.
Got it.
It's a basketball term.
Right. So states are always flopping, exaggerating the severity of the fouls against them or the mascots they claim to represent, trying to bring in the public on their side, whether they are Chinese or American or Russian. But once you're aware of the political power model of history, the next goal is to guard against both the Scylla and the Charybdis, against
Greek,
being too credulous and too cynical. So what does he mean by that?
It's just a Greek metaphor. It's used when people back when people were sailors in Greece, and it's essentially being stuck between a hard place and a rock. And for him, the hard place and the rock is being too credulous or too cynical. I don't know why he wanted to use this language specifically. Again, I think it's cute that we get to see how well read he is.
That's good. It's a little gratuitous at that point.
Sometimes, no offense.
Yeah,
no offense.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're probably not listening, but
yeah, because just
you can
as
tone
the
it down.
atrocity story is a tool for political power, unfortunately, so too is genocide denial, as we can see from the New York Times Pulitzer-winning cover-up of Stalin's Ukrainian famine. What's that about?
So actually, you mentioned in the beginning of the episode, it's Durante's piece as being, I think he was an American journalist, writing for the Times, and I think rewarded basically for his work, and then only later exposed as being actually a mouthpiece for Russian propaganda. But yeah, this is the idea that look, it doesn't matter whose side. I think it's probably a point about like, well, actually there are agents even within these regimes that are going to support other regimes, which I think is quite topical because we've seen Russian interventions in elections, for example. And this was an example of 100 years ago, or not exactly 100 years ago, maybe we're coming up to it actually. And how an apologist can be deemed favorably, probably because it was aligned with American interests at the time, and then later on, again, turned out to be complete hogwash. So.
All right, so let's conclude and then wrap this up. So to maintain this balance, to know when states are lying or not, we need a form of truth powerful enough to stand outside any state and judge it from above, a way to respond to official statistics, not with either reflexive faith or disbelief, but with dispassionate, independent calculation. The bottom-up crypto history we introduced in the previous section is clearly relevant, but to fully appreciate it, we need an allied theory, the technological truth theory of history, which we'll cover in the next episode. But
such a tease.
Just to put a bow on this, I do agree. I think it's interesting that he started with the solution rather than the problem. I think it would have made more sense to start with the problem and then introduce the solution, kind of like a startup pitch. But that said, and we'll go into, I guess, that in the next episode with the technological implications. But overall, the common thread we're seeing is states and governments will do whatever they need to do, no matter the unethical or moral implications of that, especially if they feel that they can get away with it. And even if they don't feel they can get away with it, they can consistently deny it or twist it or reframe it or change its perception effectively for the public that it doesn't matter. And so we need a better system of truth. We need a better system of accountability. We need a better system of actually dishing out consequences when these things are broken. And it brings me back to the point that we talked about a couple episodes ago, where ultimately, how much should we as a people, global population, trust governments to represent our interests and our thoughts and our actions, as opposed to having them manipulate our perceptions to avoid worse consequences, right? So to what degree is the global population or an individual national population a baby, right? That basically, if it knew the truth, would only make its own situation worse, right? Because that's what keeps coming up here is like, if we have these foolproof methods and it's just constantly the truth being shared without any manipulated perception, we need to be ready to deal with that truth on the fly and adapt and, you know, move past it. And I just don't think that's in line with how human nature works from an emotional perspective. So, you know, I think what we're more likely to see is massive emotional reactions to all of this truth coming out. And that could be a good thing if it motivates change in the right ways. And it could also be a really bad thing if it causes way worse problems with way more severe consequences.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wasn't expecting the direction you took it in the end. My closing comments would have been, I think not to beat the dead horse at this point, but I think you especially care about this if you come from a libertarian point of view. Essentially, the government is misusing our resources, and we would be better off if there was more control of its own tools and processes within our hands.
Yeah.
That's what it's arguing for. That being said, we are taxpayers and therefore further accountability. Maybe there isn't if it's there to say, hey, look, there might be an imbalance in terms of what we're giving it versus what it's providing. Interesting argument. I mean, should that be put into every agenda for each election cycle? Maybe. I think certain countries definitely deal with that issue more often than not.
I'm
On
like
the
trying
point,
to steelman the case, right? Because we've had this system to this point in time, and it has led to these results. And although there have been massive problems in the world and there's massive atrocities, etc., there's a pretty objective case to be made that we have had progress. And so the question is, would we have more progress with this consistent, immediate form of truth or less? And why? And that's the question that I'm asking myself. Now, at the same time, right, like in my personal opinion, if you're a leader and you're trying to hide what you've done, there's probably a reason why you're doing that. And it's because most of the public that you're supposed to serve wouldn't agree with that decision, right? And they'd be upset about it. So just that alone makes it clear, like, if you're hiding something, you probably fucked up. And, you know, like at that point, I want to see the examples in which holding back information from the public was to the public's greater benefit.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you can link it to a higher moral cause and or your strategy relies on some level of secrecy or asymmetrical information, but because the strategy is so airtight and the execution is professional, then you know I guess it's some kind of thing where it's like the means justifies the ends or vice versa. There might be some cases, there probably are some cases like that.
Yeah, it's worth looking into.
Again, I think it depends on what the goal is and what the purpose of the relationship that you're getting into. So people plus government, what is it, you know? And there's some moments where, yeah, you probably do want the government to take some responsibility, and it's okay if we're not in the loop because we have other things to do, and the government is a separate entity so that it can focus on its own agendas in a way that if it was entirely in the hands of people, we'd be actually quite ineffective.
Yeah. And, like, I can see a middle ground where there are real cases where national security would be legitimately threatened. And I know that that's an excuse that they'll hide behind again and again. But that doesn't deny the fact that there are situations in which it is legitimately threatened. And so it's the question of, from where we are currently to that being the case, there's a lot of room. And so even just implementing a handful of some of these suggestions would still have a significant impact, and we would get to test that out without even getting close to the examples in which this has a direct real threat that could be amplified. And it is kind of difficult to predict these things. I kind of think of it as the same with generative AI, or when AI, general intelligence AI, gets to the point where it can think for itself and do what it wants. It's very hard to predict what will happen in that case. And similarly, if we use this tech and we hold everybody accountable and we hold governments accountable and everybody's aware and there's all these emotional reactions and outbursts as a result of that, it's very difficult to see how that interplay of outrage will manifest in actions and how those actions will actually be beneficial or not, because there's just so many variables. So yeah, it's kind of this seesaw back and forth. There's a lot that we can do. We don't have to go to that extreme just yet. And that gives us a playground where we can, release an MVP, a minimum viable product of what a cryptographically verifiable history would look like in this way. And this is the same kinds of things that, for example, OpenAI, who everyone probably is aware of now because of ChatGPT, has, boards of ethics and morals, and they're constantly considering in a proactive way, what are the implications of this technology? How could this go wrong? What are the worst case scenarios? How do we protect against those worst case scenarios, right? And that's something that's absolutely necessary in this application as well, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a good teasing of our next 2 or 3 guests, actually, which I'm going to line up very soon, because the AI question is never that far away.
Okay,
AI
guys.
applied to cryptographic, the recorded history is a big subject.
For sure. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, comment, share, rate the podcast, sign up for our newsletter and our Discord. The links are in the description to get exclusive perks like our member community, deals on merch, and early access to surprises. We promise that we'll make it worth it for you. Thanks for listening. Till next time.